Amidst the pulverized remains of a German city, a general stands in silence. His uniform is a rag of dust and soot. His soldiers are hollow-eyed, hungry, and out of steel. American armor encircles them like a tightening noose. The struggle is over. Every man present feels the weight of the end. Yet, when the messenger from General George S. Patton delivers the ultimatum, the commander does not flinch. He rejects the offer of life. His subordinate stares down the American officer with cold defiance. He tells him to report that if Patton wants the city, he must seize it by force. General George S. Patton did not receive the news with rage. He grinned. He lived for these moments. What followed would be recorded as one of the most savage clashes of the entire conflict. The words General George S. Patton eventually leveled at that German commander would echo through history. Patton was a force of nature. He inspired a specific brand of terror in enemies and allies alike. He tolerated nothing less than absolute perfection. He navigated the front lines in his personal jeep. He wore a polished steel helmet and ivory-handled revolvers. He was a man of action who would personally berate any soldier lacking in fire. He once struck a shell-shocked man and branded him a coward. The resulting firestorm nearly ended his military life. Patton remained indifferent. To him, weakness was a contagion. He was the scalpel. By the spring of 1945, the Third Army was the most lethal machine on earth. They had carved a path across France since the landings. They liberated Paris and shattered the German counterattack at the Battle of the Bulge. Now, they were piercing the very heart of the Reich. Patton's armor moved with such velocity they often outpaced their own fuel trucks. Towns fell before the defenders realized the Americans had arrived. The Nazi High Command issued a desperate directive: avoid General George S. Patton. Withdraw at all costs. Do not stand and fight. But some German officers never got the word. Others were simply too prideful or too fanatical to run. One such man was General der Infantry Fritz Kramer. General der Infantry Fritz Kramer was a hardened veteran of the Wehrmacht. He had survived the freezing hell of the Eastern Front. He had walked out of the ruins of Stalingrad. He had witnessed sights that would shatter a lesser spirit. This history forged him into one of the most unyielding men in the German military. By April 1945, Kramer led a desperate mix of regulars and Waffen-SS. They held the industrial hub of Aschaffenburg on the Main River in Bavaria. The city was a vital junction. It held the bridges and rails essential for the American advance. Orders arrived directly from the bunker of Hitler in Berlin. Aschaffenburg was designated a fortress city. It was to be defended to the final bullet and the final breath. There would be no retreat. There would be no surrender. Any soldier who fled his post faced immediate execution. Cowards would hang from the nearest lamppost. General der Infantry Fritz Kramer fully intended to execute those commands to the letter. On March 25, 1945, the 45th Infantry Division reached the outskirts. These men served under the banner of the Third Army. They expected the city to collapse in hours. They were about to discover the true meaning of a fortress. Most German towns were surrendering without a fight. The war was clearly lost. Thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers were surrendering in droves. They were desperate to reach American lines before the Soviets could claim them. But as the Americans approached Aschaffenburg, the retreat stopped. A patrol was sent forward under a white flag to demand the city's surrender. They were met by a German officer with a face like stone. He listened to the demands in silence. Then he delivered the ultimatum from General Kramer. The garrison of Aschaffenburg would not yield. The Führer had ordered them to fight until the last man. Any American who entered the city was marked for death. The officer told the patrol that if they wanted the city, they would pay for it in blood. The stunned patrol returned to their lines with the news. The report moved rapidly up the chain of command. It eventually reached the commander of the Third Army. General George S. Patton was studying his maps when the message arrived. An aide later recalled the moment. Patton's face turned a deep shade of red. Then, a slow and freezing smile spread across his lips. "So," Patton said quietly, "we have a German who wants to die for Hitler. How wonderful. I will personally arrange to grant his wish." Patton did not hesitate. He ordered a massive concentration of force against Aschaffenburg. He diverted entire artillery battalions. He called for overwhelming air support. Additional infantry and tank units were sent to seal the city. There would be no escape for Kramer's men. Patton intended to make an example of them. He told his staff he wanted the city reduced to rubble. He wanted the German general brought to him alive. He had words for the man. What followed was 6 days of absolute hell. The battle for the city began on March 28th and lasted until April 3rd. It was some of the bloodiest urban combat of the entire war. Kramer was not bluffing about the price of the city. He had prepared his defenses with professional cruelty. Machine gun nests were placed in upper stories to sweep the narrow streets. Engineers had mined the bridges and rigged the roads with traps. Snipers watched from church steeples and factory towers. Kramer told his troops that death was better than surrender. He promised to execute any soldier who tried to desert. The Americans were forced to fight for every house and every room. It was brutal, close-quarters slaughter. Germans hid in cellars and attics until the GIs passed, then opened fire from the rear. The Americans learned to clear every room with grenades before entering. They stopped using doors that might be booby-trapped. Instead, they blasted holes directly through the walls. The civilian population was caught in the middle of the carnage. Thousands of women and children were trapped in basements as shells rained down. The medieval architecture of Aschaffenburg was pulverized. Buildings dating back to the 13th century were turned into burning heaps of stone. Patton visited the front lines as the fighting raged. He drove his jeep through the shattered streets, ignoring the crack of sniper fire. His jaw was set in a mask of grim determination. He stopped to speak with the wounded as they were being moved to the rear. One young private looked up from his bloody bandages. "Sir," the boy asked, "why won't they just give up? Don't they know the war is over?" General Patton watched the smoke rise over the ruins before turning back to the bleeding man at his feet. "Some men prefer the grave to admitting a mistake," he told the soldier. It was their duty to facilitate that choice. By the 5th day of the siege, the German lines began to snap. Ammunition was gone. Food was a memory. Hope had vanished entirely. General Fritz Kramer saw his thousands dwindle to a few hundred hollowed-out survivors in the city center. Behind them, the Waffen-SS prowled the wreckage like wolves. They executed any German soldier who dared to falter or retreat. One witness watched an SS sergeant murder a 15-year-old boy from the Volkster militia. The child was killed for the crime of weeping and begging for his mother. Even the shadow of the gallows could not halt the inevitable. Groups of Germans emerged from the cellar dust with their trembling hands raised. The American soldiers followed the Geneva Convention with a frozen, mechanical precision. There was no room for pity here. These men had fueled a hopeless fire and wasted hundreds of lives on both sides. The Americans processed them with a cold, silent efficiency. Yet the man who orchestrated this nightmare was still missing. On April 3rd, the resistance finally collapsed. Aschaffenburg was silent. They pulled General Fritz Kramer from the filth of the city sewers. He was a man stripped of everything but his stains. His grand final stand had achieved nothing but the burial of a beautiful city. Kramer was told that General Patton himself demanded an audience. The German straightened his tattered tunic, clinging to the ghost of his prestige. He arrived at the headquarters and was ushered into the office. Patton sat behind a desk buried in maps and reports. The 3 stars on his shoulders caught the light. The ivory-handled revolvers remained strapped to his hips. The American did not rise. He did not offer a chair. For a long moment, Patton simply stared at the German with pure, unfiltered loathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was thin and eerily calm. This only made the words more lethal. He told Kramer that he had been looking forward to this meeting. Kramer remained at attention and held his tongue. "I have killed thousands of Germans in this war," Patton remarked. "Most of them died for a cause, for a family, or for a comrade." Patton leaned forward, his eyes boring into the prisoner. "But why did your men die? They died for a city that was already lost. They died for a madman hiding in a Berlin bunker. You traded hundreds of lives for a pile of rubble. You gave them absolutely nothing." Kramer's jaw tightened, but he remained a statue of silence. Patton rose and closed the distance until their breathing mingled. His voice dropped to a lethal whisper. He told Kramer that he could respect a brave enemy. He could respect a man who fought for his country, even a country that was wrong. "I have no room for respect when it comes to a fool. And you, General Kramer, are exactly that. You traded the lives of your soldiers for a cause already in the grave. You knew it was lost. Yet pride or cowardice stopped you from making the right choice." General George S. Patton stepped back, his contempt nearly a physical weight in the room. "In a different age, I might have faced you toward a firing squad for this. But we claim to be civilized now. Instead, you will carry a far heavier burden. You will spend every remaining day of your life knowing one truth. Your final act as a soldier was a senseless, hollow waste. I hope that thought haunts you until the end." General George S. Patton turned his back and returned to his desk. "Get him out of my sight." General Kramer was led away into the silence of history. He spent the following years behind the wire of prisoner of war camps. He eventually died in 1971, a man of complete obscurity in West Germany. The price for Aschaffenburg was steep. The Americans suffered over 400 casualties. 80 of those men never went home. German losses were staggering. More than 2,000 were killed, wounded, or taken captive. The city itself lay in ruins. Its ancient architecture was reduced to dust and broken stone. General George S. Patton used this destruction as a grim classroom for the rest of Germany. He ordered leaflets dropped over other occupied cities. They carried photographs of the wreckage. The message required no translation. This is the cost of defiance. This is what happens when you challenge the American army. The tactic worked. In those final weeks, many German commanders chose life over rubble. Thousands survived because they saw the ghost of Aschaffenburg. They decided that dying for Hitler was a debt they would not pay. General George S. Patton never forgot the man who chose useless death. He recorded the encounter in his diary with cold precision. He noted that he had met the commander of Aschaffenburg, a stubborn fool who killed his men for nothing. The general wrote that the German had no answer. None of them ever do. General George S. Patton believed war stripped a man to his core. He valued aggression and the will to fight above all else. But he also understood the math of survival. He took risks and pushed the Third Army to its breaking point. Yet, he never spent lives on a lost cause. He refused to sacrifice his men just to satisfy an ego or a dead regime. This was the divide between the two commanders. General Kramer followed suicidal orders with blind obedience. General George S. Patton would never have done that. Faced with a hopeless horizon, he would have saved his men to fight another day. That is the true legacy of Aschaffenburg. Valor is not the same as idiocy. Honor is not found in a death pact. Sometimes the greatest act of command is knowing the battle is over. General George S. Patton understood this. General Kramer did not. And that is why the American general stood as the victor.